Hello, welcome you to the program. We're continuing our study of Psalm 119. Tonight we'll look at verses 25 to verse 40. If you will, turn in your Bibles to verse 25 and let's begin. In verses 25 to 32, we see the fourth set of verses recorded in Psalm 119. Verses 25 to 32. Verse 25, he said, "My soul clings to the dust. Revive me according to your word." And so this fourth section, represented by the fourth letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Daleth, and so in verses 25 to 32 of this Hebrew acrostic. And so in Hebrew, this section would begin with the letter Daleth. Verse 25, the psalmist said that his soul clings to the dust. There's a later passage in this section that says, "My soul melts from heaviness," in verse 28. And so these are very much the same. And so my soul clings to the dust, my soul melts from heaviness. This may be describing his lowliness, his humiliation, how he was brought low in life. He asked the Lord to revive him or to strengthen him according to his word. That is, according to the word of the Lord. It is the word of the Lord which can strengthen us or revive us. And so while his soul, he said, clung to the dust, and so while it was brought low, it was the word of the Lord that he believed could revive him, give him life, or strengthen him again. And so while he was weak, it would be through his word, the word of the Lord, that he could be made strong. And so here we see he says, "My soul clings to the dust," or to the ground, the dust of the ground. And as I said, verse 28, "My soul melts from heaviness." There's another psalm in the book of Psalms, Psalm 44 and verses 23 to 26. And this was written by the sons of Korah. In Psalm 44, 23 to 26, it says this, "Awake, why do you sleep, O Lord? Arise, do not cast us off forever. Why do you hide your face and forget our affliction and our oppression? For our soul is bowed down to the dust. Our body clings to the ground. Arise for our help and redeem us for your mercy's sake." Psalm 44, verse 25 in particular reads, "For our soul is bowed down to the dust. Our body clings to the ground." So very similar to what we read here in verse 25, "My soul clings to the dust." And so here we see his lowliness, how he was brought low, and how he sought the word of the Lord to revive him, to strengthen him again. Verse 26, he said, "I have declared my ways, and you answered me. Teach me your statutes." And so the psalmist declared his ways to the Lord. And so he confessed the wrong of his way, what he had done, whatever that may have been. And the Lord answered him in prayer. He wanted to learn, and he wanted to keep the statutes of the Lord. And so, as we mentioned last time, a phrase that occurs frequently in Psalm 119, teach me your statutes. Psalm 119, verse 5, "Oh, that my ways were directed to keep your statutes." And so the psalmist prayed for the Lord to direct his ways in the way of God. Psalm 119, verse 9, "How can a young man cleanse his way? by taking heed according to your word. And so what can revive him? What can strengthen him? According to verse 28 and verse 25, your word, the word of the Lord. How can a young man cleanse his way? Verse 9, by taking heed according to the word of the Lord. Verse 27, make me understand the way of your precepts. So shall I meditate on your wonderful works. The psalmist asked the Lord to help him to understand the precepts of the Lord. And so he would meditate on the precepts and the works of the Lord. Verse 28, he said, my soul melts from heaviness. Strengthen me according to your word. And so the psalmist was weary with sorrow. His soul melted, or his soul dropped with heaviness. And so that word translated melted or melt can also be rendered as drop, or literally drop with, in this case, heaviness, the heaviness of sorrow. Earlier he wrote in verse 25, my soul clings to the dust. And so here, and in verse 31, we see that he did not want to be put to shame or suffer reproach. He trusted that the Lord could revive him, that the Lord could strengthen him with his word. And so he says, my soul melts from heaviness. Just think of the weight that he felt of his soul. And so he trusted that God and the word of the Lord could revive him, could strengthen him again. We mentioned in the first lesson how that there are a number of words as synonyms for the word of the Lord, for the law of God. And we talked about that last time. Some of the ones we see here in this section include word and way and precepts and works and word again here, verse 28. Going on, verse 29, he said, remove from me the way of lying and grant me your law graciously. And so the psalmist asked the Lord to remove from him the way of lying. And so remove from me the way of lying, or the false way. He wanted the Lord to be gracious to him and graciously grant to him his law. You note here that he contrasted the way of lying with the law of the Lord. And so the law of the Lord, or the way of truth, we see in verse 30, with the way of lying. And so the way of the Lord is the way of truth, the psalmist said. And so he wanted to follow the way of the Lord rather than the way of lying, or the false way. Verse 30, he said, I have chosen the way of truth. Your judgments I have laid before me. Judgment's another synonym for the word of the Lord. And so he put aside the way of lying, having chosen the way of truth. He laid the judgments of the Lord out before him in order to follow God and his word. Verse 31, he said, I cling to your testimonies. O Lord, do not put me to shame. That word cling occurs a couple times here in the psalm. And in this case here, he's saying, I cling to your testimonies. Again, testimony is another synonym for the word of the Lord, for God and his law. Here in verse 31, the psalmist clung to the testimonies of God. He asked the Lord for his mercy, and he asked the Lord for his understanding, so that he wanted to follow him. He wanted to follow God, that way of truth. Verse 32, he said, I will run the course of your commandments, for you enlarge my heart. And so he's saying that he would run the course, or the way of the commandments of the Lord. The idea of walking in the commandments, is that of keeping the commandments. But in this case here, you have the picture of running, or running the course, running the path, the race, the way. I will run the course of your commandments. And so he would not simply walk in the commandments or keep the commandments. No, he would not simply keep them. He would hasten to keep them. And so I will run the course of your commandments. He said in the second clause of verse 32, for you shall enlarge my heart. And so he trusted that the Lord would set his heart free. He trusted that the Lord would enlarge his heart, that his heart would be so enlarged that he would be free of any hindrances or encumbrances, things that would hold him back from keeping the commandments of the Lord. And so he said, I will run the course of your commandments. There's nothing holding him back. He said, for you shall enlarge my heart. And so he served the Lord with all of his heart, and the Lord, he said, would enlarge his heart. And so there would be nothing holding him back. He would serve the Lord wholeheartedly. And so here in verses 25 to 32, we have the fourth set here of Psalm 119. Now we move on to the fifth set. And this is represented by the fifth Hebrew letter, the letter He. Psalm 119, 33 to 40. Verse 33, teach me, O Lord, the way of your statutes, and I shall keep it to the end. And so the psalmist desired to keep the way of the statutes of the Lord. And he resolved to keep the way of the statutes of the Lord right up to the end. I shall keep it to the end. The end of what? Well, this may mean the end of his life. And so he resolved to keep the way of the Lord right up until the end, right up until the end of his life. It may simply mean forever. And so I shall forever keep the way of the Lord. And so that was his resolve, his determination to so do. Verse 34, he said, give me understanding, and I shall keep your law. Indeed, I shall observe it with my whole heart. So there's that figure of the heart again, the whole heart. And so he asked the Lord for understanding. And with an understanding heart, he would keep the law of the Lord. He determined to observe the law with his whole heart, or all of his heart, his entire heart. We might refer to this as wholehearted devotion. He was wholeheartedly devoted to the Lord, to the way of the Lord, which he said was the way of truth. Verse 35, make me walk in the path of your commandments, for I delight in it. And so the psalmist said that he delighted, that he took joy in the path, in the way, in the course of the commandments of the Lord. That's why he wanted to run in the commandments of the Lord. He wanted to hasten to keep them. He desired to do so. And so he asked the Lord that he walk in the path, that he keep his way, his law. He would do so with his whole heart, verse 34. And in verse 35, he said, make me walk in the path of your commandments, for I delight in it. He delighted in the path of the commandments of the Lord. And so he would walk accordingly. Verse 36, he said to the Lord, incline my heart to your testimonies and not covetousness. And so here he contrasts righteousness with sin. He contrasts particularly the testimonies of the Lord, or the word of God, with covetousness. And so the psalmist asked the Lord to incline his heart, to turn his heart to the testimonies of the Lord, to speaking the testimonies of the Lord. sharing the word of God, of keeping that word. And while he longed to follow God, he did not long for covetousness. He did not desire to be greedy for gain. The law of Moses, you shall not covet. And so the psalmist did not desire to have covetousness in his heart. He wanted his whole heart devoted to the Lord and keeping his law and keeping his commandments. He asked the Lord to incline his heart, to turn his heart to the testimonies of the Lord and not to covetousness. Incline my heart away from covetousness or this dishonest gain, this selfish gain. He did not want to have the sin of being greedy for gain in his life. He wanted to serve the Lord and keep his word and not serve greed. Covetousness is defined as inordinate desire for wealth or possessions or whatever it may be. In Proverbs 28:16, this is a passage that might come to mind as you study these verses today. In Proverbs 28:16, Solomon recorded, "A ruler who lacks understanding is a great oppressor, but he who hates covetousness will prolong his days." In that passage, you see the wisdom of hating covetousness. And so rather than inclining his heart to covetousness, incline his heart to keeping his testimonies. And the person who is wise will turn from that greed. Verse 37, "Turn away my eyes from looking at worthless things and revive me in your way." The psalmist asked the Lord to turn away his eyes from looking at worthless things. What could worthless things mean? Well, we understand what worthless means, without worth, right? Keep my eyes from looking at worthless things. Contrast worthless things with the way of the Lord in the second clause. And while the way of the Lord is the way of truth and is eternally valuable, we see that he says, in contrast, turn my eyes away from looking at worthless things. The term worthless may refer to either something that is vain, or it could refer to something that is deceitful. In this context, it seems to refer to the things of covetousness in the previous verse 36. And so earlier he said, incline my heart to the way of the Lord, rather than the things of covetousness, verse 36. And so he contrasts these worthless things with the way or the word of the Lord. Sometimes people will apply this to any kind of sin, and I suppose that could be the case. It's just that the previous verse refers particularly to a certain sin, that is that of covetousness, in verse 36. And so, incline my way to the way of the Lord and turn my eyes away from covetousness. In this case, he says, verse 37, looking at worthless things. Sometimes someone might covet what they see their neighbor having, coveting whatever the neighbor may possess. But he said, turn my eyes away from worthless things. And so it could refer to sin in general, but it seems from verse 36, particularly covetousness. So he contrasts the worthless things of the way of sin, the way of covetousness, with the words of the Lord. There's a couple passages that may help us. Proverbs 23, verses 4-5. Again, looking at the wisdom of Solomon, Proverbs 23, 4-5. Do not overwork to be rich. Because of your own understanding, cease. Will you set your eyes on things which are not? For riches certainly make themselves wings. They fly away like an eagle toward heaven. In that passage, we see that Solomon warns about overworking to be rich, and because of one's understanding or wisdom, cease from such an inordinate desire. Will you set your eyes on things which are not? This sounds very similar to what we see here. Turn away your eyes from looking at worthless things, or covetousness, verse 36. And so he discusses the temporary nature, vanity of such a pursuit. In Proverbs 23, 4-5, Isaiah the prophet in chapter 33 and 15 said, "He who walks righteously and speaks uprightly, he who despises the gain of oppressions, who gestures with his hands, refusing bribes, who stops his ears from hearing of bloodshed, and shuts his eyes from seeing evil." Again, evil, or as we see in verse 37, worthless things could be the case. And so the psalmist calls for God to incline his heart to him, to his word, and turn his eyes away from these worthless things, whatever they may be, covetousness, greediness, whatever it may be. Revive me in your way. And so he sought strength and life through the word of the Lord. Verse 38, he said, "Establish your word to your servant, who is devoted to fearing you." We're familiar with Solomon in the book of Proverbs and the prophet, the value of wisdom. Here he said, the psalmist, "Establish your word to your servant who is devoted to fearing you." Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man, in Ecclesiastes chapter 12. Another book of Solomon. In the book of Proverbs, we see that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And here in this particular psalm, we see that he says to establish your word to your servant who is devoted to fearing you. The psalmist was devoted to fearing God. The psalmist asked the Lord to establish his word. Establish can mean to make certain, but establish your word. And so he served God, he feared the Lord, and as his servant, he wanted to firmly trust and follow him. Regrettably, there are times that he fell short, and we see him confessing these things in the psalm. Verse 39, he said, "Turn away my reproach, which I dread, for your judgments are good." So the psalmist saw the judgments of the Lord as being good. He did not wish to suffer disgrace or reproach. In Psalm 119, a couple verses earlier, in verse 22 and 31, he said this, "Remove from me reproach and contempt, for I have kept your testimonies." And in verse 31, he said, "I cling to your testimonies, O Lord, do not put me to shame." And so here in verse 39, "Turn away my reproach." This was something that he feared, that he dreaded. And he counted God's judgments as being good. Verse 40, the last verse here in the study today. "Behold, I long for your precepts. Revive me in your righteousness." And so he strongly desired to follow the precepts of God. He asked for the Lord to revive him in the way and strengthen him in the righteousness of the Lord. You think about the righteousness of God and the righteousness as directed by his word, and he longed to follow in that way. He wanted to do so wholeheartedly, in fear of the Lord, in service of him. And so he asked for the Lord to strengthen him, to revive him, give him life again. And while his soul at times dropped or melted because of the wrong of his way, we see that he trusted that it was the Lord and his word that could cleanse him from his iniquity. We hope that the lesson today has been helpful. We have more Psalms or more passages of the Psalm to study, and we invite you to come back next time. Lord willing, we'll continue our study of Psalm 119 of the book of Psalms. Thank you for being here today. Until next time.